In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Do not be afraid of them. Nothing is concealed that will not be revealed, nor secret that will not be known. What I say to you in the darkness, speak in the light. What you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a small coin? Yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's knowledge. Even all the hairs of your head are counted. So do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was. You know, it rings true with what St. Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not regard equality with God something to be grasped or robbed or exploited, but rather he emptied himself. In that Greek verb, kenao. We say kenosis is a general theological concept, but it's very real with God. And it's a paradoxical thing, because it's not like, to say vacancy is is it only a moment of preparation for a fulfillment, for a fullness, for a pleroma is the word in Greek. This pleroma, God wants to bring life. And this tohu bobohu, we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 into 2, the earth was a formless waste and surrounded by darkness over this abyss. The table for the theodrama to ensue. And again, the wedding feast at Cana. First comes the lack, and then comes the miracle. And there's a purpose to the lack, because if there was no lack, there's nothing to be filled. There's a purpose to potentiality, metaphysically speaking, because it gives divine act something to do with us creatures. The moment of adversity, it's opportunity for virtue to expand, to have work to do. So thinking of the Jewish mystical Kabbalah, it's an act of divine hospitality, making room for the other. And all this is fraught with so much metaphor and analogy. We would never say there's anything lacking in God per se, but that God actively creates what is not God. Amazing. So here we are. Yeah. And so I use that in this chapter 5, the soul as spiritual vessel, because a vessel implies a hollowness, something to fill it. And this is what the church teaches about the human soul. Officially, in magisterial documents, it's in scripture with St. Paul. And it's implicit even in the Gospel of St. John, when Jesus is talking about in his Father's house there are many mansions. St. Teresa relates this passage to the interior castle of the soul itself. To understand the soul as a substance, but a substance that involves this potentiality of relationality, this substance that in its core is room for the holy other to dwell, to abide, to circulate. So thinking of the soul not as some substance, even spiritual substance, taking up space, but it's the advantage of spirit is that it has the capacity to make room for the personal other. to take his or her place in relation to the self. The spiritual soul has the capacity for empathy, for example, that we'll talk about later. There's room in my soul to feel what the other person feels through this phenomenon of empathy. There's plenty good room in the soul, and divine grace helps to dilate the soul, expand the soul, so that it can receive its welcome contents of divinity. After all, how expansive must the soul be to receive divinity? I could state it like a paradox. We feel ourselves empty because precisely we are not empty. Our talks about the uh, anima technica vacua, the technologically vacuous soul. It's so much paradox. And like when Deacon Vincent said the soul could be filled with evil, this is a paradox because evil is nothing. And we think of Dionysius the Areopagite talking his discourse on evil. Evil is precisely lack, void, a lack of fulfillment, a lack of actuality, and living in yeah, kind of technocratic world, this world of increasing, hearing more about AI, as if AI were divine, but intelligence. Any intelligence we attribute to AI comes from us feeble creatures, and any intelligence we actually exercise comes from God. And so, yeah, what is AI? Nothing, a program, a uh, what's the word? A- Algorithms. Um, but this paradox that the soul itself can feel so empty, feel so vacuous because um, desire is being disappointed. Um, the the erotic reach of the soul is not fulfilled after all. And as Alice von Hildebrand puts it in her book, The Privilege of Being a Woman, in our age, we tend to relativize the absolute and absolutize the relative. We absolutize what is actually very ephemeral and transient, as was mentioned: money, pleasure, power, honor, health, these kind of things that, whereas we read Ignatius Loyola in the Spiritual Exercises, and he says we shouldn't be always requesting to be wealthy rather than poor, to be healthy rather than sick, to have honor rather than dishonor. And he says, in fact, we should desire to be poor with Christ, to be suffering with Christ, to be dishonored with Christ, if we are really aiming at spiritual perfection. And I think in following Christ, we could struggle a lot with duplicity, that we want uh, two cakes and to eat them both. We want the cake of the secular world and we want the cake of the kingdom of God, but they're really incompatible. And we can struggle with duplicity a lot. That we want to trust in God, but we also want to trust in ourselves at the same time. Loss, we're worried about where emptiness might leave us, and we may not give God room to be at work among us because we're too busy trusting in ourselves and our own. It's difficult because it seems quite natural for us to do this. That even as Edith Stein says, man is about the struggle for existence, the battle for existence we read earlier. And as a man in a, having a family, and it's like, yeah, I know what that is. I know what that was this morning calling the plumbing company. What's it like to be a family of 8 and not have a kitchen sink working? So, technician, make a date with a technician. The dignity of work of all of these dignified occupations. And but it's like I don't want to be dependent on the plumbing company, and I don't want them to charge more than the estimate, and all these things, and get very tense and anxious and all that. And yeah, there's a false emptiness and a true emptiness in relation to God. Um, so we could say, oftentimes we are empty because we are not empty. So again, Dionysius the Areopagite, the 6th century um, mystical theologian, who takes the pseudonym Dionysius in reference to the Pauline references to this Dionysius, but it's centuries after Paul, because he's quoting all these Neoplatonists and is quite clear from scholarship. This is a later figure. Thomas Aquinas quotes him often. The whole celestial hierarchy comes from him. Even the term hierarchy is coined, I think, by Dionysius. And he has 2 works, the celestial hierarchy on all the different orders of angels, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, all the various orders within the church. And and so Dionysius, in his work called The Divine Names, names God with both, he's writing in Greek, both the Greek word eros and agape. So in the New Testament, the word for love is agape, that eros does not occur. But in the tradition, we do find it, not prominent, but it's there. We think of also the Song of Songs, and its great nuptial metaphor about the soul and God, as many saints, including Teresa of Avila, give commentaries on the Song of Songs. And so going back to Plato and the transcendentals, the beautiful, the true, the good, and the unity of these, uh, thinking about human desire has this erotic momentum to these transcendental encounters, and really the unity of them. And so Pope Benedict XVI, in his first encyclical of 2005, Deus Caritas Est, in part 1, talks about this relationship between eros and agape, and that for Catholic theology, these are meant to work in tandem, have a unity together. Jean-Luc Marion, the contemporary French phenomenologist, wrote a book called The Erotic Phenomenon, and he unpacks this all in phenomenological terms, calling love eros. He'll reference agape along the way, but he's putting the accent on eros to follow its magnitude and to discover what really would satisfy eros. And so he'll say a provocative statement, Marion does in this book, that chastity is the erotic virtue par excellence. How could he say that? Because it doesn't collapse in something like lust. The problem with concupiscent desire is it's left not satisfied, and it's just a incurvatus in se, a curving in on the self again and again. And it's like, you know, biting into something you thought was delicious and find your mouth full of sand. It's not true. It's not that fullness. it's lacking. It's a corruption. It's distorted. It's disordered. It's that's what it is really. So anyways, yeah, Eros is within the tradition, and Dionysius names God both Eros and agape. And so Benedict's analysis is very helpful in that encyclical. And because we could say Eros without agape becomes lust and insatiable because there's no satisfaction found, because everything is reduced to utility, using things and using people like things and objects. Um, but Eros is not in itself bad. It's natural. There's a movement of desire toward the beautiful, the good, the true. Um, but agape, that self-donating love, sacrificial love, responsible love, must be united with Eros to prevent it from degenerating into very selfish, destructive desire. But agape without Eros is the categorical imperative, and it can be rather impersonal. Um, as if I don't really need you after all, as if I love just because I'm where else or something. Or, you know, when we love someone, uh, we love best when the love is personalized, when it's not just anonymous, when it's not loving a concept, but loving a person. And because the person is lovable, and if not at first glance, like one's enemy, I don't see what's naturally lovable about this person right now, said that God can make what seems unlovable worthy of love precisely by loving him or her. And Marion says similar things in his book, The Erotic Phenomenon, that we can't guarantee the other person facing me loves me. I can't. I can make the other love me. But what I can do is decide to love him, decide to love her. I can will that, even though I may not be loved in return. And that's something very powerful. Thanks so much for sharing that. That's great. I want to put forward a statement about the soul. And like last week, I want to begin with the human and divine being content. The soul is a spiritual vessel. We're really getting into Stein's major works, Potency and Act, and Finite and Eternal Being. And so I want to begin with a statement to see what you make of it. It's not something that I wrote in the book, but thinking about this first part of this chapter 5, again, we're trying to comprehend the human soul. And it's difficult. It's a difficult task because we're so used to comprehending objects, like material object. And yes, in metaphysics, we can talk about the materiality of spirit in some sense, but for the most part, when Stein is talking about matter and materiality, physical matter. And the next chapter of this book, Human and Divine Being, chapter 6, is dedicated totally to material beings. So we've been waiting for that. We've been talking about human vocation, spiritual being in general, 3 chapters on the spiritual being of the soul in relation to the material body, but we've been suspending discussion on matter and material being until chapter 6. But we'll get there and really observe what Stein has to say about matter in chapter 6, before then going into her discussion about empathy and finally the logic of the cross. But we're taking time to really try to understand the soul. And as I've said before, it's difficult to describe and explain that which is doing the describing and explaining. How can we put the self at arm's reach from the self kind of thing. It's a difficult procedure to do, but we're trying our best with Stein to do this. So I want to start with, I want to share a thought. I'll type it out here because I think that it's worth pondering alongside this chapter 5. So what I want to say is that is the living metaphysical soul is the living metaphysical exigency of its proximate opposite. And this is Wallenfang, and think about what is the soul? How is the soul in relation to the body, in relation to things made of atoms? Because we wouldn't say the soul per se is made of atoms and elements from the periodic table: hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. The soul is not made up of these things. It's in itself incorporeal, yet always in relation to the corporeal. It's what forms the corporeal, but the soul itself is not composed of atoms. So how do you understand this statement? Does it make sense? The soul is the living metaphysical exigency of its proximate opposite. Is this a fair definition of soul? Okay. Being. So it's like we can't even say what the opposite of God is without reference to God, because to say non-being implies, but there's being. So this complete lack of being, this complete lack of existence, but we can't really even imagine that because there is being. As Parmenides says, being is not lacking. If it were, it would lack everything. So even to say nothing is in reference to thing, which, like, no thing, but there is thing. There's lots of things. Is there an opposite to spiritual being? And what would be its opposite? Okay, or impotency, we could say impotency. Uh, so the opposite to pure act, which is a way to talk about divine being, would be what's called materia prima. Materia prima doesn't exist except as a empty concept, because any matter is already formed matter. But theoretically, I'm using the language of opposite act would be pure potency. Okay, so that's how we could define pure potency. Pure potency, perhaps pure materiality in reference to potency, would be the opposite of pure act. Pure spirit. Matter, this atoms, subatomic particles, elements, material elements, all of this exists precisely because it's been formed into being. So these metaphysical categories, we're tracking with all of this. We see relationality, yet we see great difference between act and potency, form and matter, spirit, body. I say opposite, but I say proximate opposite because what's implied by proximate opposite is the body, the material body. But it's proximate because it's near, it's close, it's forms a unity, in fact, with the soul. But the soul is distinct from the body still. The soul is the life-giving principle of the body. If there's no soul, there's no life in the body. There's death. There's cessation of these living processes, both biological and spiritual. No beating heart, no circulation of blood, no respiration, no more metabolism, mitosis, cellular division. The organism stops. So we're trying to isolate conceptually soul in relation to the body. How can we talk about this soul as soul? How can Jesus say, do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul? He himself is making a distinction between these two dimensions, two aspects of the human nature. So I'm trying to bring into relief what is the soul through this kind of thought. So there is a payoff here. There's a payoff. And I want to give you 3 page numbers of finite and eternal being, and to direct quotes from Stein. So I'll give you the page numbers and I'll focus on one of the three, but pages 11, footnote 31, then page 104, footnote 24, and page 159, the block quote on 159. So we haven't gotten to 159 yet, but we'll get there. But that's what I want to quote from 159 on this point. That is duplicated in the footnote on page 11, which we've read. And I said there's a lot of interesting things in the footnotes. A lot of interesting things in the footnotes, sometimes more interesting than the main body of the text. That's why I just quote so many words in the footnotes, because I want to provide it to the reader right then and there when they're thinking about it. So page 159, we have at least the English translation. I don't have the original German in front of me here, but a passage from Potency and Act, page 159 of Human and Divine Being. This is a passage from Potency and Act, this block quote. And let's see what she says here. Because again, it's for the sake of understanding the distinct metaphysical constitution of spirits in general, the soul in particular. Back to my quote too after this. So she says, philosophy based on natural reason brings us to the act of creation. And I even to think, astrophysics dates the universe. It doesn't say what we observe is evidence of is, I don't know, 19 billion years old. Where are these numbers coming from? That there's a kind of theorization to a point, to a beginning, which we would call an act of creation. A 0 point, even it was a Catholic astrophysicist, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian Catholic physicist who came up with the Big Bang Theory. It's a great reference to make when someone is saying, I don't believe in God, but I believe in the Big Bang. And you say, a Catholic priest came up with that theory. Exclusive, But to say it had a beginning is to refer to an act of creation from nothing to something. So philosophy, even based on natural reason, brings us to the act of creation, and to reason with Thomas Aquinas that we can't, track efficient causality back ad infinitum. It doesn't make logical sense. There is a first cause. This makes sense. Um, so philosophy based on natural reason brings us to the act of creation, which alone being to leap from spirit to matter. How she says that. So she's relating spirit to being and non-being matter. Matter prima materia prima has no being without form. As a concept, what we mean by materia prima is non-being. So, but here philosophy halts before a locked gate because creation, as taught by faith, remains a mystery for our knowledge, which is to say, nobody was there when it happened, just like nobody was there when the resurrection of Jesus happened either. And so only by faith do we assent to this must be the case. We could say it's a logical exigency, necessity to admit act of creation. But what it is in itself remains a mystery for our knowledge. As St. Thomas says, even when it comes to the Creator, we can only know the Creator not directly, but by his effects. And we can only know the beginning of the observable universe based on the effects since this mysterious beginning. But she goes on to say, what is absolutely spiritual and actual calls into being its direct opposite. So there's the word. Again, I don't know, I don't have the German in front of me, but it'd be interesting to see, okay, what's the German there? Let's do some etymology of even opposite in English and the German word and get more clarity of the concept. But in any case, here it is. What is non-spiritual and potential is the direct opposite of what is absolutely spiritual and actual. And she goes on to say, matter represents the utmost in potentiality. Again, at the extreme, materia prima as a concept, which means not formed matter, which means non-being. But otherwise it doesn't exist. Matter is brought to actual being by taking in form. So if we contemplate these concepts, and that's where I got this statement that I just thought about last night when I was thinking about this class and going back over all the readings, and this came back. So what is the soul then if it's not material? If it's spiritual, even though it has potentiality about it, it's still the necessary act to make alive a material body. And that's why it's created directly by God. It's not evolved from understand the soul in terms of the proximate opposite of the body, and that there's a metaphysical exigency about this. Like it must be the case. It begins with there must be more than atoms going on here. More than atoms, more than elements, more than the organs functioning all together that makes up this human being, this human person. Because in metaphysics, we make these distinctions between act and potency, form and matter, spirit, body, and the soul is more so in reference to act, form, spirit. The church teaches that the soul is anima forma corporis. The soul is the form of the body, we saw in chapter 3 of Human and Divine Being. And Edith Stein is arguing this. She thinks it's very important to say these things. This is how we come face to face with the one looking out at the world. We come face to face with ourselves. And Teresa of Avila, think of how she talks about the importance of self-knowledge and the importance of knowing the reality of the soul, as mysterious as it is. But we could think of it perhaps this way, as the living metaphysical exigency of its proximate opposite. Metaphysics is driving toward those first principles of being and contemplating those things, which must come first. Form predates a material being. It must be the case. So to say more about this statement, I would say this. We perceive the human soul as the ontological negative of the familiar and self-evident order of material being. However, what we discover is that the ontological negative reveals itself, after all, as the ontologically original. So think of a photographic negative. Think of how photography, you have the positive image A and the negative image B. And sometimes we understand what the positivity of the first image is by investigating the negativity of the second. But in the case of the soul, prior to the positivity of materiality of the body. So this is how in philosophy, anthropology, we are bringing into view, so to speak, intellectual contact with the agent intellect itself. Yes, we do have to abstract from matter. We do have to prescind from the body to arrive at what we mean by the soul. And it seems to be what Edith Stein is doing here. But I think these ideas are very valuable because they give an intellectual legibility to something like the soul, like spiritual being. These are not empty concepts. Is more full than spirit. Beautiful. Yeah, that's great. And then we observe this in the material world itself, and it also points to, using the analogy of the vessel and the ship. There's also the spiritual motivation that is at the front end of the whole thing in terms of building the vessel. That depends on the immaterial architecture in the mind of the architect, in the mind of the builder. And we have a movement from spiritual being to an actualization of this material being, a forming of this material being. But what comes first in terms of causality is the motivation, the desire, the will, the teleology and purpose of what's being done. All of these immaterial components that tend to be taken for granted are prior, are necessary for there to have this vessel in reality and moving across the water. And as you say about Jesus, that's so beautiful. And there was nothing weighing him down. And John Paul II talks about the spiritualization of the body in his theology of the body. And it's not, we know, a negation of the body or this Platonic taking leave of the body, but we profess the resurrection of the body, but a body transfigured, a body that is in its being led by spirit and we think of following Christ as this active process. I choose to follow him. I need to follow him. But what could hold me back if I'm clinging to all of these material things? Oh, or if my sin is weighing me down, or, it's like, well, I've got all these vehicles and houses and I've got all this stuff I got to take care of. How well can I follow him? Um, it could be much more difficult to be concerned more with mammon, money. Even think of money. If I were to ask you, is money more so potency or act? Again, to quote Alice von Hildebrand, we absolutize what is relative. Money is potency. Dollar bills are next to nothing. Paper, currency, I look at my bank account and I have X amount of dollars, but I don't even hold them. They're numbers on a screen. And if someone attributes ultimate reality and worth to these very ephemeral pixels that represent potency, they themselves are not act. That's a sad phenomenon. Whereas in the case of God, we're talking about pure act. And where do I see God? Most of all, to quote Augustine again from the Confessions, more interior than my inmost being, there I find you. Okay. In a sense, backwards with the statement in which we arrived at, a concept I think came to surface here that I really like is when I said the ontological negative. The soul, that's what I'm saying. The soul is the ontological negative of the kind of self-evident positivity of the body, of the flesh. But we view the soul, um, uh, light is shining. Oh, there's the soul through this process of, abstracting from matter itself. The act of abstraction is evidence of the soul. Um, and so for our nature, we have this, and I'll keep using the word opposition between body and soul. And this opposition itself is accentuated with the writings of St. Paul, for example. This battle, this contest between flesh and spirit, between sarx and pneuma, or sarx and psyche, that we have something opposing. The body wants to do one thing and the spirit wants to do another. And even Jesus says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So to understand our own nature, um, nobody's going to contest that the body is real unless, they're, some advanced philosophical position or something that they want to do that. But nobody's going to deny the reality of matter, the periodic table of elements, atom, like nobody rationally is going to deny that. But plenty of people in the name of the same rationality are not admitting that there's spiritual being, not admitting that there's soul. And so if we start with what we all agree on, it's like this apologetics, it's this active evangelization, and we want to discover the soul by um, peeling back the layers of our being, so to speak, beginning with what needs to be peeled back, which is material being. Um, so, on a cosmic level, going back to the Stein quote, God welcomes into being the opposite of God. At page 159. What is absolutely spiritual and actual calls into being its direct opposite. So everything in creation is part of this direct opposite in relation to God, including angels, including disembodied souls. There's still potency, an admixture of potency and act. And if a being has any act about it, and us persons have the most, we could say, the highest qualitative level of actual being as rational creatures, whether human or angel. It comes from the spiritual core of the being and not, in our case, from the elements involved in our bodies. But altogether, we have this opposition cosmically in relation to the created and the uncreated. Yeah, for sure. And it makes me think too of the human body itself. And the digestive tract itself, beginning with the mouth, for the food to come in. And if someone is full of it, too full of it, there's no space, there's no room, there's no communion, there's no Eucharist. You can't receive. The divine life can't circulate. There's sclerosis, there's cardiac arrest, there's a kind of build up in the vessel, build up, so there's no movement. But when we think of the beauty of eating, we could say this philosophy of eating, for example, is to say, beginning with I'm hungry for me to receive, and without this nutrition and hydration, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, and for Jesus to say on the cross, I thirst. And we all know he meant more than he just wanted some material beverage. There's a sacramentality of the body, but not in such a way that we ever dispense with the body. At the extremity of creation is matter, beginning with the concept of materia prima, but then, yes, atoms and stuff made of atoms, all these stars that fill the galaxies of the universe, all this matter, again, is the extremity of creation. And an angelic being, an angel, we could say the angel has potency, of course, but the angel has no atoms contribute to the being of an angel. Yet the angels mediate across this universe between all those things composed of atoms and themselves that are not in God, that is totally other than even an angel. So this is wonderful to think about, and that's what I hope, is that Saint Edith Stein leads us into thinking more than we've thought before. And we want to move from a simple elucidation of her own texts to with her more understanding what she had already thought. So let's take our break here, come back 10 after 11, and then we'll, come back to the other texts for today. Thanks so much. I guess it was what question I was kind of left with, like, I'm content to talk about the soul as a spiritual vessel. I get that theologically, but at the same time, um, to work to crystallize, so to speak, to concentrate the rational philosophical analysis, just as much. As Saint Augustine said, um, I believe in order to understand, and I understand so as to better believe, that kind of thing. So for me, like when thinking about the soul, it's always trying to understand the concepts better and better, and never feel like I'm at this perfect point where I've just got it. But these concepts always come in the way of invitation to think further, deeper, with even greater clarity. Um, and so I think that's what Catholic theology is always about. It's definitely what Eric Shavara was about. And there was a very prominent Protestant theologian who referred to Eric Shavara's notion of the analogia entis as like the Antichrist. Karl Barth did not appreciate what he called natural theology. Um, so that's a big difference between Protestant theology and Catholic theology in these ways. We don't believe in Catholicism and the doctrine of total depravity. We believe in the perfectibility of our nature by grace, and it's not a forensic justification from a distant thing that's taking place within us, and that reason uh, can do great work as a gift from God, and to exercise reason as far as possible. And we stand on the shoulders of giants, so all these figures, these saints, these doctors of the church, these great philosophers, we try to think what's next in a sense. We think with them, and then we're contending with our own Goliaths of doubt and challenge in our own era. But I thought it was worth our time to puzzle over these things together. But I know we have limited time left and want to make sure we get to the other readings. So is there anything else anyone wanted to bring up from Human and Divine Being before we move on to essays on woman and the other biographical pieces? Human and Divine Being. Um, Walter Redmond translated her book Potency and Act. And in the back of that book, there's not only an index, but also like a glossary of terms that he does. And so he's coordinating all the German, he gives you the German and the English translations he chose. I think that's probably the best source I can think of, but yeah, the English version of Potency and Acts and like the glossary in the back of that. Um, yeah, there is a series underway. There's a scholar named Sarah Borden Sharkey, and oh yeah, he sent me article we talked about. So I don't agree with her analysis all the time, and she probably doesn't agree with mine all the time, how a scholars can be. But I still would, recommend her. She did just publish Companion to Finite and Eternal Being. And she does pretty well with tracking with the continuity of the concepts in the German, the English translation. So, yeah, I'd recommend that. But also to know, like, the best thing to do is just if there's no cliff notes when it comes to this kind of stuff, it's you just have to dive in, and if you want to understand more, you just have to read more of the original author. And if you're curious about, like I'm curious, what is that German word? It's translated opposition that our discussion took us. So I'll go find the German edition, the critical edition, and see what's that word there, and start coordinating, for myself. Is she using Wesen or Sein, for being, or, it's being translated being or essence or um, things. So, yeah, there's some good secondary scholarship out there. Yeah, I hope my book does contribute that to some degree. Um, Even if I take a lot of creative liberties to, um, I guess, um, try to augment what Stein says in some places. Like when this book was under review, um, some of the feedback was I need to specify sometimes when an idea is my own and not Stein directly. So you can see in several of my footnotes, I say this idea is my own, like this logic of the double negative, even though it's coming from Stein, like the negation of negation, she says, but these other extrapolations. Yeah, I guess I have to claim as my own if I'm and make sure that's clarified. So I tried to do that, but yeah, it's built into the feminine genius in a way that it's not in the masculine genius. This receptivity to gift, um, and that us men have to learn from women, and especially the Blessed Virgin Mary, what this is in relation to God, um, without stopping being men. Um, and even within Jesus, the masculine genius par excellence, there's this receptivity that's exhibited too. Um, for example, when he refers to himself as a mother hen in relation to the city of Jerusalem, it's very interesting that he refers to himself as an earthbound mother bird that wants to gather the brood under her wing. Um, and how Jesus often asks questions of his listeners as a way to teach, uh, as if he wants to learn something about things from them. Um, so the receptivity of the feminine genius is exhibited above all in the Marian fiat, this Ecce Ancilla Domini, behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, which corresponds with the Ecce Homo of Jesus before Pontius Pilate on trial. Behold the man, Ecce Homo, Ecce Ancilla Domini, the new Adam and the new Eve. And we're learning something about humanity in a comprehensive way, vis-a-vis both the Savior and his mother, and that there's an interplay there, not like not as if there's no receptivity in woman and there's no initiation of gift, or I'm sorry, not that there's no receptivity in man or there's no initiation of gift in woman. These things go on with each other, but in terms of this theodrama, there are things unique to each. So this is a good segue to ethos of women's professions in Essays on Women. This is the first chapter. So it's a little earlier lecture than the last couple we've been looking at. It was a kind of breakthrough lecture, and so we hear about the Salzburg lecture in 1930, and it kind of helped put Edith on the map a bit more with the question of women in the church, women in the world. And we read her essay, what she presented there, about this ethos of women's professions. So on page 43, it begins with this concept of ethos, which she describes as an inner form, a constant spiritual attitude, a habitus, a temperament, this basic disposition of the soul under the influence of divine virtues with a concentration on values. So that's a very rich definition of ethos. And so if someone wants to ask, well, what's so different about woman in comparison to man? And Edith is going to go all the way to the concept of ethos, not just what appears different on the surface, but that there's an intrinsic difference having to do with the spiritual inner form, a constant spiritual attitude, habitus, temperament. Um, and that's meant to be influenced by divine virtues. A big point she's making in all this is to say we cannot understand who is woman and who is man apart from the question, who is God? Because it's our relation with God and God acting on the respective souls of women and men that we become what we have been created to be. So without reference to the author, yes, every creature is left to write their own script. It just stands to reason, and that's what happens. But if we seek through this, what I've called before, an obedient hermeneutics as to, oh God, why did you make me a man? Oh God, why did you make me a woman? Find things out about ourselves that we can't discover without reference to God and God's revelation. So the answer to defining woman and man uh, with stability, clarity, objectivity involves reference to God, without which uh, reason can make up its own rules apart from God. And that's, part of the essence of original sin. There could be a lot of confusion, but a concentration on values helps us to understand our being in service to these values, rather than just in service to the self that wants to do whatever it wants. There's values that precede my existence, and I should be obedient to them. So then as she goes on with this essay, uh, she considers both points of view in terms of, the natural vocation of woman, which is self-evident, at least for her and her time, probably more so than ours. But I think it still should be self-evident. Yes, woman is destined to be wife and mother. It's clear from her nature. Like, this is the telos of her being, even biologically speaking, is to become mother to another human being. If nature, runs its course, that's what her body says: maternity, motherhood, all the unity of the reproductive organs and her body and soul all together um, have this comportment. And at the same time, there's the possibility of women living not as wife and mother, uh, in a single life and in religious life, where there would be, celibacy involved. But she says the woman's soul is different from man's soul. And again, we hear this refrain in all her presentations here, that woman naturally seeks to embrace what is living, personal, and whole, stemming from her natural vocation as wife and mother. And she says a lot of things about what does it mean to be a faithful wife and mother, to participate in her husband's life. And she goes so far, she said, requires subordination and obedience. Even C.S. Lewis talked about, like, man, the husband having kind of like, I don't, the final say, so to speak. And I know we're all men here, so I'm a man speaking to men sometimes here, and I might be more careful to say things or qualify things if there are women also present. But this, I'm just quoting what this woman Edith Stein is saying here, and trying to understand what she's getting at. She, who's not even a married woman herself, but she understands this relationship between wife and husband, as the wife trusting kind of like the husband's leadership in the end. And that there's something different here between husband and wife. And Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands. And he'll say, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ, and saying these different things. But Edith Stein takes this seriously. She doesn't just gloss over it as just some historical limitation on St. Paul's thought. That there's a kernel here, an essential element that shouldn't be left behind. So it's a mutuality, it's an equality of relationship. It's not asymmetrical, but it is role differentiated. And there's something intrinsic about man and woman that suggests as much. So I maybe just give a couple more points and we can open this up for discussion. Um, so the natural vocation of man, she says, is a guide and protector of his wife. And then she has this quotation that's very paradoxical, as if the woman could say, the wife could say to her husband, obedient, I feel my soul always most beautifully free. And again, it's a trusting obedience. It's letting the husband take the lead on certain matters. Um, at the same time, Edith says elsewhere in her lectures that the husband has to realize that in many situations, he would do best if he took the advice of his wife, if he let her, bring the clarity to the whole about the situation and agreed with her. Um, but there's a lot of practical consequence to these things. And, it's a paradoxical thing. There's this other figure who came after Edith Stein in her writing. Her name is Gertrude von Lefort. Von Lefort. Lefort. Gertrude von Lefort. She wrote a very important book that's not talked about enough. It's called The Eternal Woman. And Edith knew Gertrude. They knew each other, and Gertrude knew Edith's work and in these lectures she was giving about women, and kind of took up the torch after Edith died. And Lefort publishes this book as The Eternal Woman. And it's this paradox that they're both talking about, that woman is very powerful in her ability to influence other human beings and in her relation to man. Uh, like woman, to quote another thinker, woman is like the root and man is like tree and branches. You can't really have one without the other. We don't have a complete humanity without both. But woman has this very powerful role to influence for the good, to influence man for the good. And man uh, accomplishes his greatest mission in putting himself at the service of woman and contemplating her. So the location of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and St. Edith always comes back to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Page 47, we see her. The Blessed Virgin Mary, all men and women are called to contemplate her, and this is how salvation enters the world. And so who is the most powerful human being in history? Her. Like pure human being. Then there, of course, Jesus, the God man, but the human, the most powerful, the most significant, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the second creation narrative is very interesting because woman is made last. And we have this saying in English, save the best for last. And she's like the crowning gem of creation because she embodies this receptivity to gift, the gift of God, the gift of salvation. Us men actually should be jealous in a lot of ways. I mean, we don't jump to that because I think we are men here who do contemplate woman. But how marvelous is woman? And what's my relationship as a man to the mystery of woman? At the same time, he just says on page 49, no woman is only woman, that there are other natural feminine vocations. So we get this both and happening in her work, but we see what she says first. And that's very important. That's the difference between the projects in secular feminism and what she's up to here in showcasing the dignity of woman and man. But no woman is only woman. She says every activity dealing in abstraction, which tends to be the man's thing. Look at what we were doing earlier in class today. Every activity dealing in abstraction stands in ultimate service to a living whole. So that's as if to say our abstract musings in class today mean nothing if they're not in ultimate service to the living whole of our lives, of the church, spilling, into the world, inviting the world in. So woman, she says, is able to help adjust the means to the end. Whereas man can confuse oftentimes the means and the end. Because we can have a tunnel vision about a lot of projects and goals. Page 52 and following, she talks about the unique ethos of the religious vocation then. So she goes through these things in order. The natural vocation of woman is wife and mother, other natural feminine vocations, and finally the supernatural vocation of woman that's realized, especially in religious life. And she defines it as Father Dan already referenced page 53, make an absolute gift of self to God in a self-forgetting love. And it's very striking how she says to end one's own life in order to make room for God's life. And then what Father Dan quoted, the deepest longing of a woman's heart is to give herself lovingly, to belong to another, and then to possess this other being completely. And a woman can do this in relation to God and is meant to do this in relation to God in this complete way. And man also, for that matter, is called to this full surrender of self, full gift of self, full receptivity to the influx of divine grace. And us married people, like, we have to remember again and again that Jesus says in heaven there's neither marriage nor giving in marriage. And we realize that marriage is covenant relationship till death do we part. But it's serving a greater mystery. It's pointing to the living whole that ultimately has to do with the wedding feast of the Lamb, the eschatological rendezvous of the communion of angels and saints in communion with the most holy Trinity. But in religious life, the supernatural vocation can break through. It seems a lot more with greater facility and ease in terms of there's not a lot getting in the way in terms of material concerns because of the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So finally, related to that reference we had earlier to the silent liturgy of St. Edith's solitude and prayer, on page 56 and 57, she talks about this who wrestle for endangered souls in nocturnal prayer and through voluntary penances for the sins of other people. And this is a very that is actualized in the religious life. For women, it has this great potential to be actualized in this way, even in contemplative life. Sinners. And it becomes a Eucharistic life, therefore, the one for the other, and a liturgical life. So I just wanted to make some highlights from Essays on Woman. And just the last point, I didn't have a lot of notes from Herbstreit this week, even though it was 2 chapters. I think we've hit on a lot of these points already. Addressing the professional woman and a lectureship in Munster. So just 2 more points and then open it for discussion the rest of our time here. But witnesses to St. Edith talk about how she was an embodiment of the answer she was attempting to formulate. I think that's just so beautifully put and probably can be said of every saint in this way that they already embody what their mind is attempting to formulate by God's grace, by their cooperation with this grace. And that's a pretty constant testimony about her life is people were very struck by her embodied witness ideas. And then it's a good to know, we mentioned her book Potency and Act today. She wrote that as her habilitation in 1931 as another attempt to get a university professorship, which never materialized, we know. But even after those 8 years in Speyer at the Dominican Girls' School, she still would have loved to become a professor. Um, and she had every qualification to do so. But it's just Potency and Act was written, I think, in less than a year's time, if I remember right. Mostly from home, where her mother is, her family is about, but she had a separate room where she would work and dedicate herself to writing this as one last effort to get a position, a teaching position in a university, perhaps at Freiburg or Breslau. But it never happened. It happened that were very beautiful instead. And this lectureship in Münster, which was only like a year long, I think, 32 to 33, until Hitler came in power and the persecution of the Jewish people began very widespread and explicit through political policy and everything. So those are some notes I just wanted to highlight. And yeah, turn it over to any response, questions, further discussion on these points, new observations. There's a section in there about Shavar's interaction with Edith Stein, and it does mention that interview with Heidegger and interaction she had with him. I think I read before that there were times when Heidegger and Stein were at the Husserl's home together, and maybe some other people, but she definitely interacted with him. And I don't know, we haven't talked about so much. She was appreciative of his kind of magnum opus, early magnum opus, Being in Time. Um, I think it came out in 1927, if I remember right. Um, but she was also critical of it. And I think Brother Sal's brought up some of those points. And I know Brother Sal, I think, did your um, uh, philosophy dissertation on Heidegger, if I remember right. Um, but she wrote an essay was both at this appreciative of what Heidegger was doing, but also critical of some of those things. But back to your point, Miles, about yeah, Heidegger was part of this uh interview process. He didn't, from everything I've read about that relationship, he didn't appear to be very warm and like really supportive. I think he was kind of almost indifferent, is what I gather. Um, even Husserl recommended her in the event that women would be admitted to these kind of positions, because it's a very new thing in the early 20th century. Edith is one of the first women to get a PhD in philosophy in these European universities at this time. So it's kind of this brand new territory. And but I think we have some evidence with the essay we read at the beginning of the semester on that dialogue Stein wrote between Husserl and Aquinas, and how Aquinas does most of the talking, or rejected what he called ontotheology and trying to think God in terms of metaphysics. And he tried to supersede all this, supersede this Thomistic metaphysics. But Stein is bringing it back in full force. And if Potency and Act was her habilitation, Aquinas is all over this manuscript without um, embarrassment, really. But I think that's a point that would not have just sat well with Heidegger and what he was doing in philosophy at that time. Um, but there's yeah, I've come across fragments that reference this, but I've never seen like lots of detail between, about the relationship between Heidegger and Stein, or that interview itself. There were others involved in the interview, but you know, um, we know Heidegger too was involved in the Nazi Party. And Levinas writes about this and says he finds it very difficult to forgive Heidegger on this point. And so who knows how that was playing into Heidegger's perception of Stein, who's Jewish, and she's a woman on top of that. It's so and she's very brilliant on top of that. It's we can imagine. Yeah, and I think that's a big takeaway from this course is Edith Stein was a thinker who brought together both the old and the new in a grand synthesis. And in terms of philosophy, it's classical metaphysics brought in close proximity with contemporary phenomenology. And she's not the only one doing this. Other examples would be Dietrich von Hildebrand, who is there very early on. And I think it may have been even him who introduced her to Shavara, which I read in that excerpt from the Omira book. So Dietrich von Hildebrand, Edith Stein knew him too. Max Scheler, again, we spent some time talking about him. He was bringing out that kind of intersection. Then beyond them, Karol Wojtyła does this. We see it in Theology of the Body. And Eric Shavara is doing this. Hans Urs von Balthasar will do this. It's bringing together classical metaphysics and contemporary philosophy, especially continental philosophy, phenomenology being one of the centerpieces of that, where we have both explanation, metaphysical explanation and phenomenological description. Both of these things granting us full access to truth as it reveals itself through first principles of reason and lived experience. Both of these things together. So she's a great representative of this synthesis, and it seems to be what someone like Thomas Aquinas himself would be doing had he lived in the 20th century or the 21st century. So that's something that I think as Catholic philosophers and theologians, we observe in and through the 20th century. A Protestant who's doing this too is Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur. I studied with Jean-Luc Marion in Chicago, and he's someone who doesn't do this as much. And and I'll confess, for a while when I was doing my PhD studies in Chicago, I was caught hook, line, and sinker by phenomenology. And I was imbibing all of these tropes about we have to leave metaphysics behind. And it's old, it's outdated. There's better things here on the horizon. And so I was kind of running in that direction. I was reading Marion's God Without Being, for example, and there's lots of good stuff in the book. There's lots of valuable points. But I was sensing in my being, pun intended, a lack of attentiveness to being in a metaphysical sense. And I think it really was John Paul II's work who helped me realize the sail is great, but we also need an anchor. We also need judgment to come around. We need deliberation between truth and falsehood, reality and non-reality. And so his theology of the body, his encyclical Fides et Ratio, and I'm realizing, okay, I can't just be all phenomenology in my thinking as a Catholic philosopher, theologian. I need metaphysics. I need St. Thomas and Company, and so then I really leaned back. But it was Edith Stein too. It was the first major thing I read of hers was Potency in Act. So I did a book review. I got invited to do a book review on that book, and it's over 400 pages. I read it all, every word, every page, everything. And that showed me what I needed to do in my own thinking too. And so I ended up writing these two little books. One is called they're two little introductions to phenomenology and metaphysics. They're little introductions. And at the end of both books, I essentially argue that one needs the other for genuine Catholic thinking. Um, and it was these thinkers in this kind of lineage that I wanted to live in and continue to think in. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that raises an important point too, that when we interpret Stein, um, we want to take her at her word and not be too quick to categorize her as, conservative or liberal or feminist or traditional or whatever labels like this. It's like she's just someone who's serious about the truth, uh, from all angles, both reason and revelation. And she takes scripture seriously. She takes the teaching of the church seriously. She takes the evidence of reason seriously. She takes lived experience seriously, as you're saying, and she just says it like it is. And when we read her autobiography, Life in a Jewish Family, this is something even some people have commented that knew her well, family members and friends, that she was blunt. Sometimes she was brutally honest, we say in English. And she's not trying to offend anyone, but she's just trying to say what she thinks, what she observes, and but that's how we can like trust her too, that she's not candy coating things. There's no ideology, there's no real detection of ideology, because she was such a persecuted woman. Because what she's saying, she's not saying it to win the praise of people, even though some of that came, but it wasn't the point for her. She was simply about discovering what the truth was and sharing that with other people. And that's just something, yeah, I too love about her, even in, her struggle through atheism and things. Someone who's been through the darkness, who's been through the fire, and can give that testimony in the end, to the full resonance of truth for its own sake, and not for something less than the prize that truth itself is. Yeah, so any other thoughts for today? Any of these readings? We're really getting, I think, toward the end of our uh exploration of the essays on woman, and we'll return to the hidden life pieces that really concentrate things spiritually, prayerfully. Yeah, no doubt. And that's where we're going in this course, into that invitation she poses into the mystical life. And we remember in Human and Divine Being, based on Jacques Maritain's categories of, philosophical, theological, mystical knowing and thinking. And that's where we're moving in this course. And I intentionally set it up that way. I that's how her life, the history of her life goes. Like, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and that's what's so beautiful too. Like, it doesn't plateau. It's like even to August 9th, 1942, in Auschwitz, there's a growing depth there in the face of tragedy, and that love that loves through the darkest darkness, um, and what she'll continue to teach us in following Christ to Golgotha, into the tomb, to the abode of the dead, and into the light of resurrection. Um, she leads us. For her, truth was the pearl of great price. And she gave up all that she had to buy that pearl. And that's, why she's called a saint, why she was canonized and all that, much after the fact. It's not the canonization that makes the saint, it's the saint that makes the canonization happen. And she's a saint because she's living this life of heroic virtue in pursuit of the prize, running so as to win, and sharing the fruits of her contemplation with anyone she can, even writing to the day that she was deported out of the Carmelite monastery in Echt, in the Netherlands.
I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And we might reorder, there's the atheism. There was, really trying to understand humanity through literature, language, psychology. This led to philosophy, then to phenomenology. Phenomenology really came before the metaphysics, to the possibilities within metaphysics. And then in comes metaphysics. So there's a double mysticism, philosophically, I would say, both in phenomenology and metaphysics in its own right is mystical. Um, we think of, like the Neoplatonist Plotinus and his Aeneads and this mystical ascent by the contemplation of being. So there's contemplation to be had both in classical metaphysics and contemporary phenomenology, each in their own way. And I don't know if I said this before in this class, but we can imagine, like, if we think of truth as a house, and you can tell me if I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. If we imagine truth as a house, it's got a big front door and a little back door. And the big front door of the house of truth for philosophy is classical metaphysics. Perennial philosophy always was, always will be. We can't get away from it if we want truth. We have to enter the front door, metaphysics. But a lot of people are reluctant to enter. It seems not accessible. It's kind of complicated stuff. But what people are familiar with, any person, real life, daily life, an appeal to common lived experience is the work of phenomenology. People can be invited into the house of truth through the back door, and eventually they'll meet up with metaphysics. But in our era, it seems to me for Catholic evangelization, we have to become quite savvy phenomenologists to invite a lot of people hanging out in that backyard in through the back door, referencing common lived experience and validating those things, validating the power of our desires, our motivations, all this stuff, and say, but where we find that fulfillment, that fullness, well, who we call the pure act, the uncaused cause, and creator of the universe, is, ultimately the wedding of common lived experience and metaphysical truth. So we might put it that way. And then, yes, it becomes a very mystical rendezvous in the end through the life of prayer, in that we find philosophy itself as a means to an end, and that's communion, personal communion with God, angels, and fellow saints in the kingdom.